All right, back live tonight on In Focus. The United Nations Office for Human Rights says violence in Gaza must stop and an urgent solution to decades-long conflict must be found. This as the death toll for over a week of fighting collectively breaches the 3,000 mark now. Let's talk to the UN's Office for Human Rights spokesperson, Ravina Shamdasani. Ravina, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. What happens when both sides claim legitimacy in their actions, yet when you look at it, those who suffer the most are civilians?
This is exactly the point. Those who are suffering the most are civilians. Whether or not there is a right to self-defense, whether or not there needs to be a military operation, what is clear and what is key is that both sides need to fully respect international humanitarian law. And unfortunately, we have already seen, just a week after the conflict, many potential violations, very serious violations of international humanitarian law. This is not going to help solve the problem.
And what leverage then does, for example, an organization like the UN have in this particular instance to, one, force the countries to sit on the table? Because as it seems now, there is no urgency from both sides to sit around the table. I don't know if there are any common goals that you could be looking at, that you could be pulling from as leverage to get them to want to negotiate.
I mean, really, the leverage should be the desire to protect your own civilian population. The UN has been working on many different angles. We have the Secretary General of the United Nations who has been working the phones. He has been speaking to leaders across the world, including in Israel and across the Arab region as well, to try to resolve the situation, to try to encourage all member states who do have real leverage to exercise this leverage, to insist upon respect for international law. The UN is also working on the ground to provide humanitarian support in whatever way we can, which is, of course, severely limited by the ongoing fighting, but we're doing what we can to do that. Another thing that we are doing is we're documenting what's going on, which is crucial in the fog of war, in the chaos of war, with the spread of all sorts of disinformation on social media. What we are trying to do is establish the facts of exactly what is going on, analyze it against international law, and call out violations or provide early warnings of further escalation and further potential violations of human rights law and humanitarian law.
How do we do that in a system where, I mean, it seems at some point to the international community, we are not reflecting the struggles from both sides quite equally? And Palestinians will tell you that their struggles are made invisible now because of 1,300 Israelis that were killed on that surprise attack on Saturday.
Yeah, no, this is one of the most complex situations in the world. It's a long-standing conflict. We're in the 75th year now of this conflict situation in the Israel-Palestine context. We are operating in the context of an occupation. Israel is the occupying power. There have been a lot of recent incidents where there's been discrimination, systematic discrimination, a blockade imposed upon Gaza over 16 years. But nothing justifies the abduction and murder of civilians that was carried out by Hamas. The indiscriminate shooting of rockets into Israeli territory, nothing justifies that. Such killing of civilians, such summary execution of civilians is a war crime. Now that has prompted a shock and awe attack from Israel into Gaza, which again, there's rhetoric from high-level political and military leaders in Israel that almost seems to imply that international humanitarian law is optional, that it is no longer compulsory given the gravity of the situation. Now, we need to insist that this is not the case. International humanitarian laws are the laws of war. These are exactly the laws that have to be respected no matter what, especially in the midst of an emotional, hot, supercharged situation that we're in right now. So this is why, as an international community, we all need to agree upon this respect for the fundamental, basic international humanitarian law that is applicable at this time.
What do we make of these comments by the Nuremberg trial chief prosecutor, Benjamin B. Ferencz? He says there can be no peace without justice, no justice without law, no meaningful law without a court to decide what is just and lawful under any given circumstances. I was saying that these crimes should then therefore be taken to the International Criminal Court.
These crimes are very serious crimes under international humanitarian law, and they need to be addressed. What has brought us here today is also a lack of accountability, a kind of sustained lack of accountability for previous instances where violations of human rights law and humanitarian law took place. When you have impunity for serious violations, when there is a lack of individual criminal responsibility, trials, punishment, justice for individual crimes, what ends up happening is that an entire community gets tarred with the same brush. This is not Israel versus all Palestinians. This should be Israel versus the armed attackers who carried out these war crimes on their territories. It is not correct, and it is illegal for the entire civilian population of Gaza to be punished as a result of these actions of Hamas, armed group members who went into Israel and carried out these crimes. Accountability is absolutely key. And whether this accountability takes the form of national investigations or international investigations, there needs to be clear accountability and individual criminal responsibility.
How does this work with some superpowers in the world also coming into the fray? And others have been saying it seems that the UN becomes a little bit mum, for example, when players like the US are so coming quite strongly around the attack of the Palestinian people.
This is exactly what the UN is calling for, is for all member states with leverage. And there are several member states in the region and well beyond, as you mentioned, who do have a lot of leverage on the situation. We're calling on them to use that leverage to, at the minimum, insist on respect for the law. And we are seeing some signs of insistence. I mean, the U.S. Secretary of State today made some comments about how important it is that international humanitarian law is respected and that all measures are taken to avoid civilian casualties in any military operations that Israel calls out. These are very important messages to convey to the government of Israel in this context, that international humanitarian law is not optional. It is an obligation, and we must all insist upon that, especially the powers that do have an enhanced influence on the situation.
Yeah, the sense that the U.S., even at the UN, will block, for example, the accountability of Israel in this particular matter.
Unfortunately, we're seeing that increasingly with the UN Security Council, that one state or another is blocking attempts at accountability. We have seen that in the context of Syria, in the context of Myanmar, and in the context of Israel. This helps no one. And the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN Secretary General have been very clear in their call on the international community to cast aside any kind of geopolitics and polarized binary positions, especially in such contexts where so many millions of civilian lives are at stake. And
what's going to happen now with these resolutions? Because we keep citing these resolutions, but it seems as though these are just shelved resolutions that are there, but mostly just symbolic and statements that are never implemented.
Well, we have to keep insisting upon them. We have no choice. We don't have the luxury in the international community to despair and to give up on these situations. There are solutions that have been tested, tried, agreed upon time and again, and we need to go back to those. To bring the parties to this conflict back from the brink of catastrophe for the civilians who are involved here. All the civilians living in Palestine, in Gaza, and in Israel have the right to live in dignity, to live in peace. And this war is helping no one. It is only sowing further horror and further terror among the civilian population. We need to insist upon the resolutions that were grounded in international law. And that were, hard won and agreed upon by the community of member states.
Yeah. How do you view countries like South Africa, for example, who say, well, we are ready to share some lessons on conflict resolutions, particularly where they are, coming from a point of knowing how to deal with an apartheid state, with the experience that South Africans have? And is there something that certainly the world can glean from that?
There is a lot that the world can gain from the South African experience. You had a situation that, not too long ago seemed completely intractable, unsolvable. It seemed like, there was no resolution, no solution in sight. And yet a solution was found. There were many efforts made by civil society actors, by political actors, by the international community to dismantle the apartheid regime. There are many lessons that South Africa can teach the world on this in the diplomatic setting, but also in terms of solidarity. Unfortunately, over the past week, we have been seeing protests around the world, but even many of the protest movements are divided. You have pro-Israeli protests, pro-Israeli civilian protests, and pro-Palestinian civilian protests. How does that make any sense? Should we not all agree at least on the fundamental value that each human life is valuable, and your life does not change in value depending on where you were raised, depending on your race or your ethnicity? We should at least be able to agree on that bare minimum standard. So for all South Africans, I think it would be important to show solidarity to all victims, all civilian victims of this war, and to insist that their lives are spared, that all steps are taken by the parties to the conflict to spare civilians, whether they be Israeli, Palestinian, or others.
What do we make then as the world of this call by the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, of a robust process of seeking solutions towards peace? What should we be expecting? I mean, there have been, for example, calls even from South Africa to open corridors for humanitarian assistance to be able to get into Gaza, and such calls seemingly are not getting a favorable response.
The humanitarian corridor is crucial. Again, this is one of those bare minimums in a state of war that we need to be able to agree on, that civilians should not be made to suffer unnecessarily. Starvation of civilians due to deprivation of, the control of food, control of water and other basic supplies, of fuel. This is not allowed under international law. Civilians need to have access to their basic humanitarian needs. So we are calling very strongly for the establishment of a humanitarian corridor so that these basic supplies can make it to civilians. We are also seeing, unfortunately, hospitals and medical facilities that are being forced to evacuate, that are receiving evacuation orders in northern Gaza. These are orders that are impossible to follow. When you've got patients in ICU, in intensive care, when you've got neonatal units with babies that will die if you leave them behind, but you cannot evacuate them with all the medical material that they need. This is an impossible call. So we're seeing a lot of doctors refusing to evacuate, insisting that they're going to stay with their patients. Yeah. To put doctors and patients in these kinds of situations, it's inhuman and it's a violation of international humanitarian law. So these are the basic standards that the UN is insisting upon: the creation of a humanitarian corridor and the respect for international humanitarian law so that medical facilities and medical staff are not targeted. And that all people have access to their basic needs, even in the midst of a conflict.
Now, Ravina, of course, many countries have always endorsed this idea of a two-state solution. But do you think a two-state solution with no consequences for actions on both sides will find traction?
The two-state solution absolutely is still the solution, but not without consequences. In international human rights law, we insist that there must never be amnesties for war crimes or for very serious violations of international human rights law or international humanitarian law. As I mentioned earlier, there need to be consequences, but those consequences need to be grounded in individual criminal responsibility, in due process, in fair trials, and in fair prosecutions. Only then can we move forward from this cycle of, tarring entire communities with the brush of criminal or terrorist, and the sense of vengeance that fuels this conflict further. Accountability will be key. in addition to implementing the two-state solution.
Ravina, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on. Speaking on behalf of the UN Human Rights Office there, Ravina Shamdasani.